Welcome to the American Intelligence Media, the home of the anonymous patriots and aim for truth. I am your host, Douglas Gabriel, Thomas Paine and the ass of the globalist, and today I intend to inflict more pain on the ass of the globalist, especially being encouraged by Trump's talk last night from the Oval Office. I'm going to interview Michael McKibben, the most amazing researcher that we've ever come across. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, Douglas. Thanks for the compliment, but I do want to give kudos to all those helping us, too.
Yes, matter of fact, you could even, if they aren't anonymous, call out their names at any point when you say, oh, thank you so-and-so for the amazing genealogy research. Or it's astounding, the researchers that you have and what you're able to do.
Well, these are all quite humble people, so I probably won't do that.
You know, we thought that we had covered so many bases with our Anonymous Patriots intelligence reports that we had come to kind of an end of revealing the inner workings of the deep state, i.e., the senior executive service, and all the many ramifications as it spreads out throughout the globe, as well as the past. Because without a perspective of the past and history, you cannot predict the future. And if you look closely at history, you're seeing that most of the present is simply repeating history. So if you know those patterns, they will repeat. And what you have discovered now is the birth of the mother of propaganda, and especially propagandizing a nation's own domestic citizens. Now, we had busted that story open some time ago because of Obama's changing the National Defense Authorization Act in 2012 to make propagandizing Americans legal. But what you have shown is we are in an unhappy birthday of 100 years of this mother of propaganda, which started with the British War Council. What was it called? It was
War Cabinet.
Cabinet, excuse me, and the Propaganda Ministry of Information and the War Propaganda Bureau. And this has been official for 100 years. And the exact machinations have hardly changed at all. The Brits steal patents, they steal the technology, they steal the inside banking information, they steal the inside court fake justice, because why? The Privy Council has the head of the Bank of England on it. It also has the Chief Judge of the Queen's Court, which outrules all courts in England and Britain and the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth nations. And we have found that the true sources of this, and right down to the very people, which you're going to describe in great detail here, are the very people who took up the idea of the will of Cecil Rhodes. And the will of Cecil Rhodes had one thing as its primary goal, which was to align Britain with America, no matter what, and use wars to bring America into an alignment with Britain so that there will be an Anglo-American axis that will rule the world. And this is basically stated as the imperialism of the largest corporations that ever existed on the face of the earth, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and those things that came after it, controlled through the Privy Council. So once again, you have literally found the very individuals on the Privy Council who started what we have now become, which is a target of surveillance in all aspects of our life, and all propagandized from every direction. And our yellow journalism is so thick that mainstream media all reads the same script from Avid and ISIS management. But it goes back to the Brits. And again, today we're going to mention this Integrity Initiative, this group, which shows you that what Michael and his researchers are going to tell you now is still happening to this very day, because we're going to put an article in the below this where you can see that this is still happening. And it's happening on a massive scale, and practically every major member of the Privy Council has their own propaganda machine. And it's paid for by the British government, or in many cases by George Soros, or in some cases by U.S. taxpayers. We are being propagandized with our own taxes to believe lies. And this is, in fact, during the time of the Obama administration, legal. It is no longer legal, folks. And because Trump has come to power, if we use the Decency in Broadcasting Act, we can closed down the mainstream media, which is nothing more than a Tavistock extension of the Frankfurt School of Thought, which merged with the war corporations that then broke out into their own private corporations that still control our media and our propaganda to this very day. And it goes back, as always, to a very small group of people, and we can stop it. And that's the beautiful part. So who are these scoundrels that started the mother of propagandizing, Michael?
They are the War Cabinet formed, the Imperial War Cabinet formed in 1917 by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the four others on this five-man cabinet were Earl Curzon, Viscount Milner, Bonner Law, and Arthur Henderson. And in the Americans for Innovation latest article, there is a photo of these people that somebody created back in 1917 that shows you their photographs.
Well, this Imperial War Board cabinet, Lord Alfred Milner was the chief student of Cecil Rhodes, and Cecil Rhodes' Round Table became later called Milner's Round Table, which later was called the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which through the Pilgrim Society and the Fabian Pilgrim Society and the Fabian Group, they spread to America and created the Council on Foreign Relations, which basically created all of our foreign policy for decades and decades. And that is the Anglo-American alliance that Cecil Rhodes was hoping for. It actually came to pass. Now, tell us about the way the War Board transformed until it, after the war, it became also privatized.
Right. It was formed several months after Lloyd George became Prime Minister. We've had people reading many documents of the records that they created. What we noticed at first is, even at the time, observers were noticing that Lloyd George was implementing an entirely new way of organizing his cabinet. And so previously the cabinets were populated by members of Parliament. And so these were all elected officials. But what Lloyd George did is he created this small five-man cabinet, and then he brought in hundreds of advisors and consultants on various topics. And the other thing he did was he set up this secretariat of scribes, basically, that would take meticulous notes of all the meetings that they had. And they would actually publish those records at the time, contemporaneous to the meeting, soon after the meeting, and then distribute those records to the people that participated. Now, on the surface, you think, fine, that's how most of our companies operate. But then you're thinking, wait a second, this was during the war, World War I. And so the question we started asking ourselves was, what is he doing here? Because by formally publishing these, I mean, they had them printed. They transcribed the meetings, then they had them published and then distributed to the participants. Now, from a standpoint of our contemporaneous experience with leaks in Washington, don't you think he was setting up his war cabinet to be a leaking sieve by publishing all of his minutes this way? So there you go. There's a first bit of a signal of an agenda, a private agenda. And then we started looking at the resumes of these various people, and you've mentioned Milner, who was also extremely instrumental in what appears to be the betrayal of Tsar Nicholas II, because within 3 weeks of Milner coming back from a trip to St. Petersburg, where he met with Tsar Nicholas and had authority to start providing resources for the Tsar to fight against the revolutionaries that were descending upon the country, he actually refused to give the Tsar the money. And then 3 weeks after he got back, the revolution began. And a week after that, Vladimir Lenin left in a specially organized train car with 28 other people. And they were allowed to pass over the various borders in Europe and head all the way back to St. Petersburg, where within 6 months the October Revolution occurred, and Russia was then officially communist. And that was all part of Milner's activity. So you start to wonder there, what was Milner all about? So you start seeing all these hidden agendas right away with this Lloyd George War Cabinet. And then it gets more interesting from there. So rather than do a big, long summary, I'm going to stop and have you ask questions, if that's okay, Douglas.
Well, yes, and also, as we're looking at this, we need to remember that the British way had already come to America in 1911, and by the time Woodrow Wilson came to power as the president, he appointed a group called an inquiry, and they were, just like the group you just described, major holders in huge industries. Matter of fact, the key players, they would be called the robber barons of their age. They were basically then made into monopolies. And that is essentially what happened with this Imperial War Cabinet. Was
Yes.
They were volunteers, but they also owned everything, so everything they did affected everything, and you just pointed out how they started the Bolshevik Revolution. One man, Alfred Milner. One man. He actually stood against what he had been told to do by the Parliament in giving money and arms to the Tsar. And because he did not do that, the Tsar was deposed, and you know the story. And basically, that was the birth of communism, Soviet communism. And that was basically the decision of one man acting upon the thoughts of his teacher, which was Cecil Rhodes, who said only a British and American alignment can create a superpower that will be the global power of the world. But to do so, you need to control intelligence, information. This is an information war. This is counter-information. This is counter-intelligence and counter-propaganda, because these Brits became the kings of propaganda, as we know, not only with the written works, but also with radio, with television, with movies. They basically learned that the control of the media was the control of the mind of the people. And that is what swayed opinion, and that is what got either support for administrative action and monarchical parliamentary action, and in America, political action, or not. And so Woodrow Wilson
Douglas,
sold us out.
I think that they probably, they learned that propaganda was effective in World War I, much more effective, I think, than they expected it to be. The propaganda that occurred in the First World War was on training wheels. And I think what we see now is that the process began then, and then once they realized how effective it was, because what did they do? In 1914, they started the War Propaganda Bureau, and with a gentleman by the name of Charles Masterson, and he proceeded to hire Britain's best artists and writers to write all this fiction. Now, we're talking about people we all know about. I mean, Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. We're talking about H.G. Wells. We're talking about very famous writers, very talented writers. And what they discovered is that they could create stories that would get the British public and the Allied public to believe whatever they wanted. They said, this isn't that hard. All we have to do is write an article where we make up a story about German atrocities from the German soldiers, and everybody in England believes it. Because why? There's no way to say that it's not true, no way to verify it. So, of course, the Queen's not going to lie to us, so we believe it. And in fact, somebody who just read the Americans for Innovation story this morning is a very well-known and very successful British advertising executive. And he said people have no idea how effective these techniques are in bending their minds to even lies, and especially lies, because all propaganda is lies. It's dressed up like facts, but it's all lies. And so what we see here is that the British government, right at the beginning of World War I, started the Propaganda Bureau, hired all these writers and artists, created all this propaganda, realized by 1917 how effective it was. And so the War Cabinet then reorganized the propaganda, expanded its budget, and then made it a formal part of the War Cabinet called the Propaganda Ministry of Information. It was sometimes called the Propaganda Department, and other times it was called the Ministry of Information, but its official name was the Ministry of Information. And they put the writer, John Buchan, in charge of it, and he was then in charge for the rest of the war. And we have access to many of his actual reports and documents that show how they proceeded to improve their successful activities, and then within months of the department being approved to be created. And by the way, this department was not created by Parliament. This was a secret department created within the War Cabinet, and it's clear that Parliament really didn't have any say at all in this department, and only started asking questions in 1918 after they were starting to plan on winding it down. But within months of Buchan becoming the director of this Ministry of Disinformation, he then requested to Lloyd George that they be allowed to also propagandize the British people. And then, let's see, what day was that? That was May. That was in February 20th. And then in May, Buchan asked that they be able to target the British public. And then on August 4th, Lloyd George announced that they would start propagandizing the British public, and they called it the National War Aims Committee, the NWAC. So don't we see that? They always give it some obscure name to fool the general public. The fact is, they called it that. It was called that in the press, but nobody knew what they did. And now we know they were turning their propaganda guns on their own people. What we see later MPs starting to complain about is this organization is not acting in interest of the British public. This organization is acting in the interest of the War Cabinet. So it became effectively a secret operation against the British people.
Yeah, essentially corporate warlords, as I always call them.
Yeah, I think it's more than essentially is probably too kind. It absolutely what we now see from the facts that came out later in Parliament. These ministers, this five-man committee, were heavy holders in many major corporate activities in mining, in banking, in shipbuilding, newspapers, media. We even see that one of the employees of this group, to this day, his family owns Getty Images, which we now see all over the web. So we have discovered the continuity between this group of people and what is absolutely happening today. And it appears that all Barack Obama did when he came into office is he mimicked the organization that the War Cabinet created, because what the War Cabinet was able to do is operate in almost complete autonomy, just like the Obama cabinet started acting after he became president in 2009.
Exactly, and that is the tie-in. That's why it's 100 years. In 2012, He basically took the War Aims Information Committee's exact model and overlaid it on the National Defense Authorization Act,
Yes,
along with
exactly.
his rewriting of the Patriot Act, which he called the U.S. Freedom Act. And then he created a group called the Global Engagement Center, who he actually paid Brits, the Strategic Communications Laboratory, the mother company of Cambridge Analytica. And now we know another group called Integrity Initiative clearly paid them to simply propagandize Americans during the election. And it is legal because he wrote it in to the law, and it was following the exact model of this group, which was basically the first corporate warlords who were basically using war and especially high-tech information. They cut the cable to Germany, and then they more than boycotted them. They put so many sanctions on Germany that they could do nothing but have a war with Britain. Britain actually attacked Germany,
Right.
but nobody will know
So it
that.
appears that this war cabinet was out to do two things. One, it was to defeat Germany and its economic capability, and also defeat Russia through the Bolshevik Revolution. So it looks like this Anglo-American axis was involved using war to take away its competitors going forward. And that is what they did.
Following the model of the Dutch and British East India Companies, which followed the model of the German Hanseatic League. Now, the British were very jealous of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's own propaganda. They had
Yes.
very serious propaganda going on there, and it was also their scientific institute, and they were doing crazy experiments. But they were jealous of them, and so they were trying to keep up with the fact that they were openly propagandizing all other nations to basically say Germany should lead the world. They should be the imperialistic hegemony for the world, and that's what Britain was fighting. But they knew that if they linked with the East, with the Prussians and with the Russians and everything East, that Britain wouldn't have a chance. And then Alfred Lord Milner, after he had been in South Africa and saw the battles, the Boer Wars, both 1 and 2, and the Transvaal, and what happened between the Germans, the Dutch, and the British in South Africa, came back to Britain and said, I don't want any more of that. We need to destroy the Germans completely, and we need to cut off their connection to the British, to the Russians, and that's the reason why Alfred Milner himself personally helped start the Bolshevik Revolution. As a matter of fact, he was basically the father of it by being the philanthropist and the politician who set it up as a false flag.
It wasn't philanthropy. Parliament had already approved funds for the Tsar, who was, by the way, Queen Victoria's grandson. So he went to Russia, and everybody expected him to provide the cash so that he could deal with the revolutionaries. What he came back and did was trashed Russia, the Tsar, his organization, his capacity to handle the money. You name it. It sounds like fake news now. So he came back and gave a report to the War Cabinet, not to Parliament, by the way, and dismissed all the threats of revolution. And then, interestingly, a week after he got back, Lenin takes his little train trek to St. Petersburg. I know that's just coincidence, Douglas, but I just wanted to point that out.
Well, another thing to point out, which is a coincidence, is look at the list of banks who supported the Bolshevik Revolution. They were American banks, half of them. And the ones that were American banks were actually prior Brits who came to America. So we're looking at New York City Bank, we're looking at Rockefeller, we're looking at Morgan, we're looking at Rothschild, we're looking at Hambro, who you're going to now probably get into. Eric and Charles Hambro show you that the continuity of the clear intent to create corporate warlordism through propaganda and control of corporations by basically having insider groups that are beyond politics, that are beyond governmental control, who simply are the robber barons who sit in their little committee and determine what war will happen next, because then they
Right.
make a ton of money off of it.
Well, we just had somebody looking at the estimates of how many souls have been lost during this 100 years of these people's treachery, and it's really difficult to come up with a number, but it could be several hundred million people were sacrificed for this agenda. Up to now, we know there are many numbers out there, but the bottom line is it's tens of millions for sure. And what we're seeing is this group of men did not care who died while they worked to take this control. And we need to point out that this department promised Parliament numerous times not to be involved in politics, because the MPs had suspicions that they were going to turn their secrecy and their propaganda against the country and would become political. And they promised over and over again that they would not become political. And then our researchers in England found a document on December 17th of 1917. The director of the Department of Information proposed a psychological offensive, this is the actual title, psychological offensive, to be launched at a well-selected psychological moment. And then in his proposal, he proceeded to take this opportunity to issue this, what he called a, what did he call that? He called that a manifesto declaring British support for a League of Nations, which he put in quotes because it wasn't an actual proposal at that point. But clearly, this group of people were looking for an opportunity to impose their political will on the British and the world, and were using the war and the weariness of war as an opportunity to get everybody to sign off on this League of Nations that they could put out there as a manifesto. Now, the one thing that really caught my attention as we're looking at this psychological offensive plan is, doesn't that sound very similar to 9/11 and then the rush to the Patriot Act, which had already been written up, by the way, within months of 9/11? So what we have is a situation where nothing we see in the British War Cabinet and their experiences at controlling the British public and the world public is different than what we've seen in the last 20 years with our deep state shadow government, and how they are mimicking all these activities to finish this takeover that they started in 1914.
With some of the same people's relatives.
Yes.
If you take George Soros, Lord Malik, and Barack Obama out of the picture, how many millions would not have died? And then that's literally just a few people. And then if you look at Alfred Milner, Viscount Milner's action, he wrote the Balfour Declaration. Balfour didn't write it, giving Israel claim to a homeland. How many people have died by that? And then during the Treaty of Versailles, he was there, and he was in every single closed-door deal, and he was part of the Sykes-Picot deal, which is the chopping up of the Levant, which is Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the whole thing.
Wow.
How many people
I did not know
died?
that, Douglas. I
This
did
is
not
one
know
man.
that. We haven't looked at that part of it.
This is one man. One
Wow.
man. But let's remember, the Arab Spring was one man. That was Barack Obama, who killed 2 million people. He dropped over 200,000 bombs in the 8 years he was president. He was at war every day of those 8 years, and he never stopped, and he created the migrant crisis, which created the invasion of Europe. One man, following the orders of his boss, George Soros. So let's remember, Barack Obama is CIA. CIA was created by the Office of OSS, and the OSS was created by the British SOE. Tell us about Eric and his son Charles Hambro and the way that they created what we now know as the rogue CIA, and it's been going on since these events that Michael is describing to you during World War I in Britain.
Yes, when John Buchanan prepared a report in December 20th of 1918, we have the report. It's called the Report on the Liquidation of the Ministry of Information Transferred to the Foreign Office War Cabinet. That's the title. It's I forget how many pages it is, about 6 pages. In that, he tells about how they're going to split up the different activities that are occurring in the propaganda department. And one thing is clear, they're not intending to stop any of these activities after the war. And then we see how they gave control of America and wireless technology and most of the rest of the world to the Foreign Office, and how they took cinema and films and slides and art and gave that off to their friends in private industry. And then, interestingly, they gave off their information management to a company in Spain, called the British FBI. It had the same acronym. It was the Federation of British Industries. So there we see probably the original fusion of the public-private partnership right there in spying and illegal surveillance, right there in that particular moment. But then in the document, at the last paragraph, he thanks a bunch of people who, without any pay, stayed on to help him create this new organization. So there you go. They're not being paid. Why are they staying on? So what we did is we started looking at the name. And it didn't take long, because I lived in England, and one of the names that popped out at me was Eric Hambro. And if you live in the UK, Hambro Bank, Hambro's Bank, is one of the larger banks in the UK. And so started looking at his background, and sure enough, after he left, helped reorganize the Ministry of Information, within 2 months, the Queen knighted him, or the King knighted him. And then he, after that, became the chairman of Hasbro's Bank. And he lived until 1947, till the winter of 1947. But after he continued his career in banking, you see that Hasbro's had extensive holdings all over the world. And then one of the things that Hasbro's did during his lifetime was sold off part of their operation to the French, Société Générale, and then Société Générale turned around and sold their holdings to Investec in South Africa. And for those that have listened to some of our interviews in the past, Investec, of course, rang all kinds of bells, because we now know that Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who was a close associate of George Soros, is one of the directors of Investec as of 2016. And Malloch Brown is so close, they're almost bunk buddies. He's a director of the Open Society Foundation, is or has been Open Society Foundation, the Soros Management Fund, and one other Soros holding. So anyway, there we see contemporary association with people that are tied up in the current global cabal to form a one world government, with the people that actually operated inside the Ministry of Information during the 1914 to 1917-18 time frame in the UK in World War I. Now, if that's not good enough, the other thing you just brought up was the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And that group was conceived as a stay-behind network during World War II to be in place in case the Germans overran any country. They could have this espionage group inside the country ready to be called, like the underground. They in fact were the underground in many countries. So at the end of World War II, we see the SOE reorganizing. But what we didn't know was who was running the SOE prior to that. And as it turns out, it's Eric Hambrough's son, Charles, who is also a Sir. They were both knighted. So here we've got Hambrough's son running the SOE, the stay-behind units. What they did in World War II is they didn't disband at the end of World War II. They just created a new reason to stay together, keep the band together. And so they turned their attention to the new global enemy, which was the Soviet Union. And so it became an anti-communist stay-behind network. Now, where else recently do we keep hearing this idea of a stay-behind network? This is a quiz for you.
Where do we keep hearing it now? Well, it's called Gladio, and it's happening all over. It still happens, still going on. So I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, how about the Senior Executive Service?
Oh, of course, they are that.
The 10,000 stay-behind Obama network.
Absolutely.
So the stay-behind concept was created in World War II to fight the Germans, and then at the end of the war, so they could keep the band together, they made it a stay-behind unit to fight the Soviets in the Cold War. And now what we see is that same concept has been applied in the U.S. through the Senior Executive Service to create a stay-behind network to sabotage future administrations of the government so that these guys stay in power. So what we see is exactly the same thing as was occurring back when Charles Hambrough took over SOE. So he's now the link forward to Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who we know also owns Smartmatic voting machines, has been heavily involved in propaganda and vote rigging all over the world. He has massive financial holdings, hundreds of financial holdings and relationships all over the world. He's a member of the Privy Council, along with Sir Geoffrey Patty. And so what we see is the same activity with different names as came out of the British Ministry of Information.
Another thing we see there is that Eric Hambrough, World War I, the basic propaganda Ministry of Information continued on to foment dissent for World War II. Then after World War II, it wasn't over. The stay-behinds, which became what we now call the Rogue CIA, and literally Charles Hambrough trained Wild Bill Donovan, trained Allen Dulles, the person responsible who basically ordered the death of JFK and then sat on the commission to find himself innocent. Allen Dulles, who basically was the founder of our modern CIA, and if you want to look at him and his brother, you can't get much more corrupt. They were both members of the Inquiry Group. They were both part of what is called the British Way, where they sit on committees, where you only come to the committee if you're invited, and no one writes anything down because it's all word of mouth, and yet you sit and you plan the demise of countries far in advance, demise of banks, of demise of currencies, of economies. And this is what a George Soros does, sitting around talking to people like Angela Merkel and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. He told them what to do. Remember, they are puppets of George Soros because he was on the founding group with Lord Malloch of the Open Society, which is basically the new statement of what we'd call chaos Marxism. It's the new political far left. And each of these groups, for instance, Geoffrey Patty and Lord Malloch Brown, have their own propaganda group, the Strategic Communications Laboratory and Cambridge Analytica. Those are just some of the extensions. They have many, many, many. The one that has now popped up into the news, which we're going to have in the dialogue box below, is about Integrity Initiative, which just popped up because it's a little teensy tiny office, and one person from that group was part of the Bernie group, and they called him a Brit for Bernie. And now we find out that they are a massively funded and infiltrating group that is equal to Strategic Communications Laboratory, which has basically folded and more than likely has put their money into this group because now it's becoming extremely pervasive in America, and the infiltration of our elections is more shocking than you may imagine. And this group is one of many groups, and it's a Tavistock group, of course. It's mind benders, it's perception managers, it's the people who think that through propaganda and basically using media as a weapon that they can control public opinion. And they can. They sit in an office right next to BAT, British American Tobacco, one of the number one murdering companies and corporations. You can't name a worse warlord.
Well, BAT is identified as one of the holdings of some of the members within the Ministry of Information. And this was actually called out by a member of Parliament in 2018, who actually went into the backgrounds of these people, and he said, "There's something wrong here, folks. They're not out for the country; they're out for themselves." Is essentially what he said. But if we go back to your comment about Tavistock and the psychological warfare, what we did in this, what AFI did in the article was stop at the end of the war, but that was exactly when the British Psychological Society was organizing its efforts to essentially combine propaganda with psychiatry. And one of the things we see, and we've all heard of, is the studies that were going on. And oh, by the way, the Germans or the Brits in the medical area never stopped being enamored by German psychiatry. And so even during the war, German psychological warfare manuals were being used by the Brits. And so at the end of the war, a lot of that German psychiatry was actually incorporated into a lot of these therapies that they were creating to help soldiers who came back with shell shock, they called it. This looked to be a catch-all term to essentially do all sorts of experiments disguised as treatments on British soldiers coming back. But what they noticed, and this is really interesting with what's going on now with all this attempt to confuse sexuality, is they noticed that how these demoralized men came back basically emasculated. Their masculinity was at a low ebb, and they studied all that. Now, what you can say is, okay, you can use information for good or evil, and what it looks like to us is that this research has been incorporated into much of the propaganda and the use of psychiatry to essentially emasculate men over time. And they don't do it all at once. It's not a big thing. It's subtle. And I think if anybody is honest with themselves with the current fare in the media, we would have to say that there is now an overt attempt to essentially discredit men, to emasculate their masculinity and confuse the genders, and in the case of marriage, to actually destroy the sanctity of marriage.
Yes, the Frankfurt School's intent is to break down the structure of society, create what I call chaos. So why Marxism can then move in, and then the economic predators can take over, the bankers, the warlords. And that's basically standard operating procedure. What you've demonstrated not only was when you pointed out that the true New World Order, the true globalist intent, was created right out of the British Imperial War Cabinet, because they have that intent. It was their absolute clear intent to have a League of Nations to control the world. Their other intent was to basically use all technology against the enemy with false flags, propagandize your own people, and use propaganda as a tool of war. But then later in World War II and the Tavistock Institute and the all that was done with the War Propaganda Board in World War II, that was an attempt to basically break down society completely and forever. And it is the birth, it is the mother birth, I shouldn't say mother, it was father birth, it was the birth of PSYOPs, psychological operations intent on surveilling, targeting, and attacking an enemy. And that is what our governments have been doing since the First World War. And they're actually quite proud of it because they become very rich at it. And they took it even out of the realm of politics into the realm of ownership of corporations. And now I tell you, any international corporation that does military deals with both sides of the war, they are criminals and they should be locked up.
Let's talk what I commented on earlier about Lloyd George printing out and distributing all of his meeting notes. That is so counterintuitive to somebody who is actually interested in security and privacy. You're not going to just willy-nilly start distributing like that. Even if you stamp it as secret, it's going to get out. It's going to leak. And so by doing that, the guarantee was it would leak. And we started looking at that from the standpoint of, okay, what was the overt purpose or the covert purpose for doing that? And then it hit us just like a ton of bricks. They want it leaked. They want it out there. And what it appears is by giving your friends and your enemies all of your conversations, what your enemies will do with that is attempt to take advantage of you. But if you then also control, which they did starting in 2014, the wireless and communication capabilities, and you're monitoring everything, you're always going to be one step ahead of what your enemies know about you. And so what that does is two things. One is it allows you to stay ahead of those enemies, but two, it allows you to make the excuse that you need more war money because these people are getting closer and they're threatening you. So it's a brilliant deniability strategy, because if it leaks, you didn't give it out. It was taken out by somebody who may have leaked it or may have left it in their briefcase or on a desk. You never know how these things get out. But once they're out, you've got deniability. There's nobody can be held accountable for giving up state secrets in this model. And then where else have we seen that? If we wind forward to 2009 and Hillary's private server in her basement, where we now know she sold access to that server to the highest bidder. Well, if you're really concerned about America's classified information, you're not going to do that. But if you are one of these globalists who uses this war cabinet strategy, you give all your information out because your NSA folks are seeing what people do with it. You can stay ahead of it, so it's never going to really be a threat, but then you can use it to fund more war machines and more war armaments for your friends who are invested in all those companies. It is brilliant.
It was brilliant. And we now know that China got a courtesy copy of every one of Hillary's emails. We know that every single thing on her server was known by China and probably many others. And what they did was, the second that Obama came to power and Hillary was linked, because, of course, she got the Secretary of State because she stood down. Both of them had George Soros money. George Soros chose Obama first. That was a mistake on his part. George has been making some pretty big mistakes. But from the beginning, what did they do? They said they knew they were going to use their own accounts, not government accounts, their own phones, not government phones, so that they couldn't have them FOIA'd, Freedom of Information Act requests. And so then they created, for the first time in American security history, the stupidest idea ever, that the two of them and 5 others, I believe it was, could classify or declassify on the fly, right then, on the spot. That's insanity.
Yes.
That's the craziest thing ever, but that is what the Imperial War Cabinet did. They had the ability to even demand everything that the War Department had, everything that the Foreign Department had, everything that the Economic Department, everything everyone had, and then they, as private individuals, making money off every single deal, off every single decision, and controlling, literally, in some cases, the politics and of the whole world. Really, the governments of the world are controlled by the Optech software that controls election machines throughout many, many countries, that is run by, and it was started by Lord Malik Brown when he was at the United Nations in Venezuela working with Jimmy Carter and the rogue CIA. And to this very day, every single digital electronic speck of information for our elections is filtered through Optech. So Lord Malik Brown, to this very moment, controls the politics of the world.
Let me remind you. We had to refresh my mind on all of Malik Brown's conflicts, but he is a director of Thomson Reuters, the Guardian Global Development Fund or Group, the World Economic Forum, Open Society, Quantum Fund, Soros Management Fund, and now director of Investec, which traces back to Hambro. So there we have a third generation of player. I would consider Malik Brown a second generation. And so now we're into the third generation of these people from the War Cabinet. And when you look at their holdings and their influence and their resumes, they all knew what they were doing. It worked. They could see that Parliament would not really hold them accountable. In fact, we actually read a very good complaint that occurred in 2018 with one of the MPs going into specific details about all the conflicts of interest among these people. And we see this fusion of propaganda, psychiatry, banking and commerce, and technology, specifically communication technology. And those people learned all of those skills in World War I. And they applied them against the whole world. And why is it, the other question is well, maybe why didn't America take over this organization, this strategy? And there's probably a very simple reason, in that anybody that's doing this in America has got the Constitution to deal with. And they don't have that problem in England, because the key people here are part of the Privy Council. And so they can, figuratively speaking, run behind the Queen's skirts to hide any form of accountability. And the other big issue, which any spy will tell you, is that these confidentiality and secrecy agreements that they have to sign when they learn any of these informations puts their life on the line if they share it with anybody. So that's how they've gotten away with this agenda for 100 years. Everything that they do in the UK and they do in America is all under government secrecy. And that's why, for example, in our case, after we recognized that our technology was stolen, it was so hard to figure out who did what to us and when. But now we know, and I think this is the encouraging thing for patriots, is while these people do a pretty good job at hiding their treachery, they can't completely hide it. And then once you start knowing what you're looking for, they leave a trail all over the map, all over the world. And that's where I encourage everyone to start digging in any of these trails that have been identified in all this research.
Well, Michael, we have to thank you and your researchers and your friends over at Americans for Innovation and all these amazing articles and these amazing revelations as they come forth. And we want to thank you today for helping us celebrate the unhappy birthday of 100 years of war propaganda by warlord, corporate, I don't even have a name for them, monsters, I guess we could call them, and also for helping us realize that the birth of the global hegemony from the Brits was also out of this same imperial war cabinet, and that later, through their generations of their own kind, through a basic lineage of propagandists and war criminals and warlords, we can see that their children invented psyops. And once they added high tech to it and added what they stole from you in later technology, we can see that this is out of control. It's pervasive, but it's been going on for 100 years. And the British system has filtered into our system so that we have a shadow government right now that we need to extricate from our own government so that we can put our U.S. Constitution back into the position it should be and restore the Republic. So, Michael, thank you for helping us celebrate this unhappy birthday for propaganda, for globalists, for British hegemony, and for PSYOPs. And again, thank you to your researchers all over the world, because we get to hear some of these amazing stories of things that people call in, write in, and send you. And all we can say is thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you for helping with this research. Thank you for helping us dig these things up from the mine and bring them to the light.
Well, Douglas, let's make this the last year. No more anniversaries.
Excellent point. Let's make sure they don't live to be 101. Let's call them out and make sure they get their birthday spankings, every single one of them, in public, so that the very people who've been doing this should go away ashamed directly to jail.